There comes a moment when even the kindest soul, the most forgiving heart, the one who gave second chances like they were free, suddenly stops, not with drama, not with rage, but with a silence so profound it echoes through the very fabric of the relationship. This is the moment the empath stops forgiving. And when that happens, every mask around them begins to fall. Most people believe that the empath is endlessly patient, eternally loving, always ready to forgive. And for a time, that is true. The empath sees the good in others even when it hides behind pain, dysfunction, or cruelty. They excuse bad behavior with phrases like, "they're just hurting," or "they don't know any better." They tell themselves stories to protect not only the people they love, but their own fragile hope that love can heal everything. But the empath's forgiveness is not infinite. It has a cost, and that cost is often themselves. Every time they forgive a betrayal, swallow a hurt, or silence their needs to keep peace, they chip away at their own sense of worth. They become smaller in rooms where they should have stood tall. They become quieter in moments they should have spoken. And over time, the weight of carrying everyone else's pain becomes unbearable. It starts with exhaustion, then emotional burnout, then numbness, then comes the moment of awakening. It's not always dramatic. It can happen while doing something as simple as making coffee or staring out a window. But suddenly, something clicks. The empath sees the truth, the manipulation, the pattern, the empty apologies, the cycle of hurt followed by guilt, then temporary change, only to return to the same place again. They remember all the times they were made to feel guilty for having boundaries, all the times their kindness was taken for granted, all the times they were told they were too sensitive or too emotional just because they felt things deeply. They realize that forgiveness, in its purest form, is sacred. But when given to the undeserving, it becomes a prison. And that's when it happens. The empath stops forgiving. They stop explaining themselves. They stop offering grace to those who weaponized it. They stop absorbing pain that isn't theirs. And the moment they do, the masks fall. The charming manipulator becomes hostile. The passive-aggressive friend grows cold. The needy lover turns distant. The entitled relative becomes cruel. The people who once relied on the empath's compassion reveal their true faces because the game has ended. You see, when the empath forgives, they give others a chance to hide, to reset, to put the mask back on and pretend. But when the forgiveness stops, there is no more hiding. The truth must stand bare, and most people cannot handle that kind of exposure. Especially not from someone they once controlled with guilt, shame, or emotional dependence. This moment is not about revenge. It is not about resentment. It is about clarity. It is about the soul saying, "I've had enough," not because it stopped loving, but because it finally started loving itself. And this is what makes the moment so powerful. The empath does not yell. They do not seek to punish. They simply walk away, and in their silence, they carry more power than words ever could. That silence speaks of self-respect. It says, "I am no longer available for your chaos." It says, "My peace matters now." Alan Watts once said that to understand yourself is to watch the way your mind works. The empath's mind, when free from the fog of people-pleasing, becomes a mirror that reflects the truth of everyone around them. And when that mirror stops bending to accommodate lies, it becomes impossible for others to keep pretending. This is the power of an empath's awakening. It reveals, it exposes, and it liberates. If you've ever reached this point in your own life, where your silence held more weight than 1,000 forgiven wounds, then you know this truth deeply. You know that the moment you stopped forgiving, not out of hatred but out of healing, you saw clearly for the first time, and nothing was ever the same again. Now, I'd love to know, have you ever had to stop forgiving someone in order to find your peace? If so, comment below with just this word, awakened. Let that word speak for the moment your soul chose itself. The empath's inner world, why they keep forgiving. To understand why an empath forgives so much, we must first journey into the quiet depths of their inner world. Empaths are not driven by logic alone. They are driven by emotion, intuition, and an almost supernatural ability to feel what others are going through. They do not just witness pain, they absorb it. When someone near them is angry, the empath feels that anger vibrating in their own chest. When someone is sad, the empath feels their heart tighten, as if the sadness were their own. This is not a choice, it is how they are wired. From an early age, empaths often learn to regulate the emotional temperature of a room. In chaotic households or environments filled with tension, the empath becomes the peacekeeper. They sense when something is wrong before a word is spoken. They try to fix what others cannot even see. They learn to anticipate needs, soothe wounds, and take responsibility for the emotional well-being of others. Over time, this becomes second nature. They do not know how to watch someone suffer and not intervene. But this gift comes at a price. Because they feel so much, empaths often confuse their own emotions with those of others. They carry the weight of pain that does not belong to them. And when someone they love hurts them, their first instinct is not to protect themselves, but to understand the other person's pain. They ask, what made them act this way? Or, how can I help them change? They search for the wound behind the weapon, the reason behind the rage. This is the beginning of a dangerous pattern. The empath begins to equate forgiveness with healing. They believe that if they just forgive enough, love enough, stay kind enough, the other person will finally see them, appreciate them, and change. They mistake endurance for strength. They think that staying silent in the face of mistreatment is noble. They don't realize that their forgiveness is becoming a mask that hides the truth. Alan Watts once spoke of how most people confuse the idea of being spiritual with being agreeable. But true spirituality is not about being agreeable to everything. It is about being aligned with truth. And for the empath, that truth is often buried under layers of guilt, fear, and the belief that love must hurt in order to matter. They forgive over and over again, thinking that each time will be the last. They excuse betrayals. They justify bad behavior. They tell themselves that people can change. And while this may be true, what they fail to see is that people rarely change when there are no consequences. Forgiveness, when given too freely, can become an enabler of dysfunction. And so the empath becomes trapped in a cycle. They feel the pain. They forgive. The pain returns. They forgive again. They hope. They endure. And all the while, their own needs are silenced. Their voice becomes faint. Their self-worth begins to erode. But why do they do it? Because empaths carry a deep belief that love should redeem. That if they just love someone enough, that love will transform them. They believe that their role is to heal, that their pain has a purpose, and perhaps it does, but not the one they think. The true purpose of that pain is not to keep forgiving those who harm them. The purpose is to awaken, to learn discernment, to realize that unconditional love does not mean unconditional tolerance. That kindness without boundaries becomes self-neglect. This realization does not come easily. It comes after many heartbreaks. It comes after being taken for granted, manipulated, and misunderstood. It comes after crying alone in the dark, asking why love always seems to hurt so much. And finally, it comes in a whisper. Maybe it's time to choose myself. That is when the shift begins. Forgiveness is beautiful when it is rooted in wisdom. But when it becomes a shield to protect others at the cost of the self, it becomes a burden. And the empath, in their journey to heal others, must learn that they too deserve to be whole. If you've ever felt like you were forgiving more than you could handle, or loving someone at the expense of your peace, you are not alone. Your heart is not weak. It is wise. And now it is learning a new kind of strength. The turning point. The moment the empath awakens. It does not always arrive with thunder. There is no dramatic collapse, no grand confrontation. Often, the moment an empath awakens is so quiet that even they almost miss it. It can happen while they are folding laundry. It can come while they are lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. Sometimes it arrives in the middle of a conversation, when a familiar phrase triggers a memory, and suddenly, something deep inside them stirs. It is not anger. It is not fear. It is clarity. The empath begins to see. They see the pattern, not for the first time, but for the first time clearly. They see how many times they were blamed for the emotional chaos of others, how many times they were told they were too sensitive, too emotional, too much. They see how apologies were used as resets, not as true signs of change, how moments of tenderness were used to cover deeper manipulations. And with this clarity, they no longer feel confused. They feel awake. Alan Watts once said that waking up is painful, not because it reveals new things, but because it strips away the lies we told ourselves to feel safe. That is exactly what happens here. The empath realizes that much of what they called love was really fear. Fear of being abandoned. Fear of being unloved. Fear of causing pain. And now, in this quiet moment of awakening, they are forced to confront the truth. They were never responsible for everyone else's happiness. They were never required to carry the weight of others' emotional immaturity. They were not created to be a sponge for the wounds of the world. And finally, they feel it deep in their bones. They are allowed to stop. This moment is sacred. It is the moment the empath chooses themselves. It does not mean they stop caring. It does not mean they become cold. On the contrary, it is the first time their care is pointed inward. They begin to look at themselves the way they once looked at others, with compassion, with understanding, with patience. They forgive themselves for not seeing the red flags. They forgive themselves for staying too long. They forgive themselves for not speaking up when they had the chance. And something remarkable begins to happen. The empath, for the first time, sets boundaries. At first, these boundaries feel uncomfortable. They feel unnatural. The empath is used to saying yes, to giving without pause, to stretching themselves thin to avoid conflict. But now a new voice rises within, a voice that says, "You matter too." With every boundary set, something inside strengthens. The empath realizes they do not need to justify their peace. They do not owe explanations for their healing. They do not have to apologize for no longer being available to toxic patterns. As they begin to speak their truth, some people around them resist. They question the change. They accuse the empath of being selfish. But the empath is no longer afraid of those words, because now they understand that protecting their energy is not selfish. It is sacred. As the empath awakens, they also begin to recognize manipulation in its many forms. Love bombing, guilt tripping, silent treatment, emotional baiting. These tactics, once effective, now fall flat. The empath no longer dances to that rhythm. They see it for what it is, a desperate attempt to regain control over someone who has finally become free. This freedom is not loud. It is not declared with fire and fury. It is subtle, like the first breath after being underwater. It is steady, like the beating of a heart that has returned home. The empath no longer plays roles. They are not the fixer, the pleaser, the one who always understands. They are simply themselves. And that is enough. In this space, they begin to attract different energy, people who honor boundaries, relationships based on mutual respect, conversations that do not drain but uplift. They begin to live in truth, not in obligation, and that truth sets the tone for every decision moving forward. The awakening of the empath is not an ending. It is a beginning. It is the birth of a new chapter, one in which they are no longer a background character in someone else's drama. They are the author of their own piece, and that piece, once claimed, becomes non-negotiable. What happens when the forgiveness stops? The moment the empath stops forgiving, the room shifts. Something invisible yet undeniable changes in the air. Those who once felt comfortable overstepping boundaries suddenly become uneasy. The balance they depended on, the unspoken permission to hurt without consequence, disappears. And as the empath begins to reclaim their energy, a silent storm brews in the lives of those who once relied on their endless tolerance. The first reaction is often confusion. People who have grown used to the empath's kindness do not immediately recognize the shift. They assume it is temporary. They believe the empath is just having a bad day or feeling emotional. But when the empath no longer responds with softness, no longer justifies harmful behavior, and no longer participates in the same emotional loops, the truth becomes harder to ignore. The second reaction is resistance. Those who benefited from the empath's forgiveness begin to feel threatened. They challenge the change. They poke at the old wounds. They say things like, "You've changed," or "I thought you were different." They accuse the empath of being distant, cold, or selfish. But what they are really saying is, "You are no longer easy to control." And that scares them. When the forgiveness stops, masks fall. The charming manipulator begins to show signs of frustration. The passive-aggressive friend becomes openly critical. The emotionally dependent partner turns cold or even cruel. Without the comfort of guaranteed forgiveness, these individuals lose their advantage. They can no longer reset the game with empty apologies. They can no longer count on the empath to clean up the emotional mess they leave behind. Alan Watts once reflected on the nature of roles we play in relationships. He believed that much of human interaction is a performance. When someone refuses to continue playing their role, the entire script falls apart. That is exactly what happens when the empath withdraws forgiveness. They exit the stage. They stop participating in the illusion. And those left behind are forced to confront their own character without the safety net of unconditional grace. This moment can be painful, not only for others, but for the empath as well. They may feel guilt at first. Years of conditioning taught them to soothe others even at the cost of themselves. But with each boundary held, that guilt fades. In its place rises a sense of empowerment. A quiet confidence begins to grow. They realize they are no longer afraid of disappointing people who never feared hurting them. The people who truly care, who genuinely value the empath, respond differently. They adapt, they reflect, they honor the new boundaries and seek to understand the change. These are the relationships that survive the shift. But those that were built on imbalance, manipulation, or emotional dependence begin to collapse. Some fall apart quickly, others fade over time. Either way, the shedding is necessary. This is the cost of awakening, but it is also its gift. As the empath stops forgiving everyone without question, they begin to forgive themselves. For all the times they stayed too long, for all the moments they accepted less than they deserved, for all the nights they cried in silence, convincing themselves that love meant staying. Now, they choose differently. They choose relationships that are reciprocal, conversations that are honest, connections that do not leave them drained, and most of all, they choose peace. This peace is not just the absence of conflict. It is the presence of self-respect. It is the calm that comes from no longer bending to fit into places where they were never seen clearly. When the forgiveness stops, a new chapter begins. A chapter where the empath walks with eyes open. They see people for who they are, not for who they hope they can become. They no longer chase potential. They recognize patterns, and they honor the lessons learned through every heartbreak. This chapter is not about revenge. It is not about punishment. It is about truth. And in that truth, the empath finds a strength that was always there, buried beneath the need to be loved at any cost. Let the cost be paid. Let the masks fall. Let the silence speak. Because sometimes the greatest act of love is walking away. There is something sacred about the moment an empath steps into their power. It does not happen with fanfare. It does not announce itself loudly. It happens quietly, like a sunrise after a long night. But its effect is transformative. The empath, once known for their gentle spirit and endless forgiveness, now radiates something different. They still possess kindness, but it is no longer laced with fear. They still love deeply, but it is no longer given without discernment. They still care, but they have learned to care for themselves first. This is what it means to move from being an empath to becoming empowered. Empowerment does not mean abandoning compassion. It means understanding its proper place. The empowered empath has not lost their ability to feel. They have refined their ability to choose. They no longer feel obligated to fix others. They no longer confuse love with sacrifice. Instead, they recognize that healthy relationships require mutual effort, respect, and emotional responsibility. Alan Watts once said that the true self is not something one finds, but something one allows. In stepping into empowerment, the empath allows their true self to emerge, not the version molded by fear of rejection, not the persona shaped by others' expectations, but the raw, honest self who knows they are worthy, even when they say no, even when they walk away, even when they choose peace over chaos. In this new chapter, the empath speaks with clarity. They say what they mean and no longer sugarcoat their truth to keep others comfortable. They set boundaries without guilt. They rest without apologizing. They listen to their intuition and act on it. They stop explaining their value. Instead, they live it. Every decision they make is guided by alignment, not obligation. This shift changes everything. The people around them start to notice. Some are inspired. They see the change and want to grow as well. Others resist it. They miss the version of the empath that was easier to manipulate. But the empowered empath no longer bends to keep anyone in their life. They have learned that not everyone deserves a front row seat. Some people were only meant to be lessons, not lifelong companions. With empowerment also comes a new kind of solitude, not loneliness, but sacred solitude. The empath now understands that being alone is not something to fear. It is a space of renewal, a time to reconnect with the self. In solitude, they find their voice. They remember who they were before the world told them who to be. This new way of living brings peace, a peace that cannot be shaken by other people's chaos, a peace that is rooted in truth, not performance. The empowered empath no longer needs external validation to feel whole. They are no longer driven by the need to be understood by everyone. They know that those who are meant to walk with them will understand without explanation. Forgiveness still exists in their heart, but it is offered with wisdom. They do not forgive to keep people close. They forgive to keep themselves free. Free from resentment, free from bitterness, but also free from repeating the same cycles. Now, forgiveness comes with distance when necessary. It comes with boundaries. It comes with the clear understanding that healing is a personal journey, and they are no longer willing to be someone else's emotional crutch. As this chapter unfolds, the empowered empath becomes a mirror. They reflect truth, not illusion. They invite others to rise, but never at the cost of their own fall. They give, but they do not bleed. They love, but they do not lose themselves. They walk with compassion, but also with strength. This journey from empath to empowered is not always easy. It requires unlearning. It requires courage. It requires walking away from familiar pain and stepping into unknown peace. But once this shift occurs, there is no going back. The empath has seen their own light, and now that they know its worth, they protect it fiercely. Let this be your reminder. You are allowed to evolve. You are allowed to change. You are allowed to become someone who honors themselves as much as they have honored others. You are allowed to write a new story, one in which you are not just the healer, but also the healed. If this message resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on your journey. And if you are stepping into your own power, I invite you to share this video with someone who needs it. Together, we rise.